So here at the start, we have King Solomon has just finished two major building projects, his royal palace and the temple of the Lord. These impressive constructions have further revealed to us the affections competing in the king's heart. Over the next few chapters, we'll see Solomon become even greater and even worse. He offers one of Scripture's most beautiful, pious prayers, and he glorifies the God of Israel through his unrivaled wisdom. In nearly the same breath, however, he continues to magnify himself in ways that ultimately prove he is not the promised son of David Israel truly needs. So we have proof. Let's. Yeah, let's look at chapter 8 here. It's a fairly long chapter. Let me just read the first section here. It says, so 1 Kings chapter 8, I'll be reading from the NIV, because it's the Bible my mommy gave me. Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the men of Israel came to gather to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered around about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place. Here, hold on a second. Okay. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. Then he said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his own hands has fulfilled what he promised with his own mouth to my father David. For he said, since the day I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe of Israel to have a temple built for my name to be there, but I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. My father David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, because it was in your heart to build a temple for my name, you did well to have this in your heart. Nevertheless, you are not the one to build the temple, but your son, who is your own flesh and blood. He is the one who will build the temple for my name. The Lord has kept the promise he made. I have succeeded David my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel, just as the Lord promised. And I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. I provided a place there for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our fathers when he brought them out of Egypt. And then we have a beautiful prayer that he's going to give there. Let's come back to the summary there. But we see, so in as Sarah says, so I'm on page 44 of your study guide. He says here, in verse 2, all the men of Israel came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. And then Sarah has here in question 2, from 1 Kings 8:2, we know that Solomon timed the dedication of the temple to coincide with an annual week-long feast festival celebrated in Israel. We know quite a bit about this feast from Moses' writings. If you had a chance to look at the homework ahead of time, so looking back in Leviticus, what was the name of this feast called? And there's a couple different names depending on your translation. Feast of the Tabernacle. What's another name for it? You got a booths. Yep, booths, tabernacle. I think, is that hold on, I think that's a different one. But you have it's also known as tents or huts, and so it's the word sukkot in Hebrew. That's translated all these different ways, and this was a feast that then would occur. Well, we'll go down there. Let's go through and we'll see. So the second question: what were the Israelites not to do during the feast? Yep, any ordinary work. Yep. And what were they to do? Okay. Anything in particular? It says food offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrifice, drink offerings, all kinds of stuff. Right? This was a time, and if you looked at then the next one, what did this feast celebrate? The what? Yeah. So essentially, so which of our holidays did we pattern after this? Yeah, Thanksgiving, and it's all is safely gathered in. Ere the winter storms begin, it's that celebration of the harvest, and that's the same thing that they've got going on here. That and I preached on this before. That essentially there were three main harvests that took place in Israel that celebrated the various harvests, and this would be kind of the final one of the final one of the year. That they, if you look at the crops in Israel, it's always grain, grapes, and olives. Those are the three major crops, and they're always in that order because that's in the order in the year that you'd harvest. So you'd start with the grain harvest, or the barley, and then the wheat, and then sometimes that coincides with the whole idea of bread, and you'll hear those exchange. Then with the grapes, that's they sometimes talk about bread, wine, and oil. Okay, that's grain, grapes, and olives, and so what you have here then is after the last main harvest. And the whole point is it's a time of celebration, and it's that God was supposed to be. Assuming, and it's also, if you remember, God said to Moses I think it's in Deuteronomy, where he's so when they're in the Exodus, he's going to say, the land of Israel is not like the land of Egypt. In Egypt, you had the Nile River, and the Nile would flood, and you had irrigation off the Nile, and that's how Egypt grew its crops. It was dependent upon the Nile River. In Israel, you don't have that. You have the Jordan River, but it's down deep in a valley. Essentially, it was minimally useful for any kind of agricultural purposes, until until the 20th century, when you can build pumps that'll move the water for you. But it says that instead, what you're going to be dependent upon is God sending rain. So the Israelites were completely dependent upon rainfall, and when there wasn't rain, people died. Because you weren't. It's not like here now where we've got grain stored up for years, where we could have a huge crop failure and might make prices go up a little bit, but people wouldn't die from it. Then they would, and there was like when you had Elijah with the time of no rain, right, where he says there's going to be a drought because you disobeyed me, and that was always a picture through here that part of the blessing of being faithful to God is that God would then send the rains, and that was always key here. So when you have an abundant harvest in Israel, it's thank you, God. You sent the rain. You protected us from marauding enemies. You protected us from the locusts coming in and eating stuff up. Thank you for your faithful love to us that gave us all this bounty. And so that's so that again that's the ideal situation that's supposed to happen. and again, so the when these Israelites reading this are in Babylon reading this, they're like, oh yeah, those were the good old days. Why? Because then we were following the Lord. So what? Here in Leviticus 23:42, it says, "What else were the Israelites to do?" Yeah, yep. And what was the reason for that? Going into the next question. Yeah. So it's like a reenactment. Hey, this is how our forefathers lived for 40 years. We're gonna, and it's impossible to overstate the importance of the Exodus in the Old Testament. And when you read the Ten Commandments start with the introduction. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That's the central event. It's the same. It has the same place in the Old Testament that the Gospels do in the New. Obviously, the Gospel is much greater because in Jesus. But as far as the narrative goes, that's the parallel. And so when was this? It was after the grain and grape harvest is what there. And who was to celebrate? Your last question there. Yeah. You'd have a hard time finding something that. So even the foreigner that happens to be traveling through, right? Everyone's supposed to take part of this. And okay, so that's the event, and we're going to see that Solomon then intentionally chooses that festival for the dedication of the Lord's temple. So here in question 3, we read of the ark, which represented the very presence of the Lord, finally being brought into the temple. It was a grand time of celebration and week-long feasting. See 2 Chronicles. And we see Solomon intentionally obeying and honoring the Lord through it all. Using the list below, match the verses from this 1 Kings 8 scene to the verses from the law being followed. All right. So who carries the ark? Is in which reference is that for those who got there? All right, and what's that talk about? Who's supposed to carry the ark? The priest had to do it. All right. Yep. What's the second one here? Regarding the cherubim. What does that connect to? Yep. Yeah. So you had the command for the ark itself, where the cherubim were on top with their wings pointed at each other, and then we've got the whole big thing in the temple as well. What about the poles of the ark? It ties up with what verse there? We're running low, so. Yeah. And what does it say about that? What's the point there? Yeah. And why? And this you got to kind of read into it, but it's pretty apparent. Well, why do you need these poles? What's the purpose of having the poles? Yeah, so you don't touch the ark. So you take these poles, and then they're the sockets on the side of the ark that you slide it in, so that the ark itself never gets touched. And we're going to see that here. And then the last one obviously ties up with the command to have the Ten Commandments placed there in the tabernacle, the original ones. She says it in question 4, though. Look back at 1 Samuel 6:19 through 20 and 2 Samuel 6:1 through 11. What has previously happened when Israel hasn't approached the ark on God's terms? What happened in those passages? What's that? Yeah, death. You didn't, and even the one, and David was upset about the one when it gets brought in, right? Where the fellow was Uzzah, was that the guy? Was that the guy's name? Who, where the ark's shaking and he's worried it's going to fall, so he reaches his hand out to steady it, and boom, God strikes him dead. And there's, and so what do we learn here from this? Because it seems doesn't God seem a little bit, I mean, isn't he a little bit too fussy? Gary, what do you?
Mainly, the way I see it is he should have trusted God, not to let himself.
Yeah, and yeah, lack of trust in God, and yeah, synonymous. Um, and where does it say in the that obedience is better than sacrifice, and sacrifice is part of the system as well, but it's a whole lot better to just be obedient in the first place, and that God requires obedience, and God is a God of justice, and our works matter. Do you realize, about this is an aside, but as long as I'm feeling queasier and queasier, do you realize that we're still saved by works, and that because we say the old under Adam's law it was works and now it's faith, and that's all true. Of course, we've heard it all our lives as Christians, but truthfully, we're still saved by works, and it's that Jesus has done the works, and so God's law is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and we're works matter to the extent of we get into heaven by works. They just happen to be Jesus' works because we don't have them, and that's the extent to which God does require obedience is consistent throughout. Anyway, I don't know what brought me there besides a fever. If you look at so down to question. Any thought? Any comment? We all good? Okay. Looking back at Exodus 40, which describes the presence of the Lord coming to the tabernacle Moses built. How is that account similar to the account we read in 1 Kings 8, verses 10 to 11? Are there any notable differences?
Both were by clouds.
Okay.
That was a similarity.
Yep.
I guess the difference, the ministers.
Okay. What else? In both cases, you couldn't enter, right? Both cases where you said the glory of the Lord filled. In Exodus, there were a couple more elements. Fire, yeah. You have the fire by night is mentioned in Exodus. Yeah, exactly. It rose as a sign that it was time to move, and so it was actually the cloud was leading them. God leads his dear children along. Kind of the old hymn. So yeah, whereas here the movement is done, right? There's now a fixed place that God has chosen where he's going to be present with his people. All right. The interesting stuff here. She says next, focus on 8:12 to 21. How does Solomon open his address to the assembly? It says, the Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. All right, this is kind of fun to play with. It says, look up Psalm 18 and Psalm 97. What image of the Lord do these verses create? Anybody? Anybody at all? Yeah. But he himself is what? Light. Yet he's covered in darkness. And she says, then now look up 1 John 1:5. How can we think about this truth in light of the verses from, I don't know if she meant that as a pun, in light of the verses from Psalms and 1 Kings 8? What is it that God, that it says God is? What is? God is light, and in him there is no darkness, right? So what's the purpose of the darkness? Why the darkness here? Why is it necessary at Mount Sinai or here at the temple? Why is it necessary? Kyle, what you got?
I mean, I took away the darkness is to keep them from straying from the path. Like, here's what happens if you don't follow the path I've laid for you.
True. What happens, yeah, okay. What happens though if, if the cloud isn't there and you just have the light, I'm fading, I'm sorry. No, I'll just mind. Yeah, I could really use it. If there's a bottle of water on the tea cart, could you grab that? I'm really thirsty. Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry guys. Oof. I don't think a cat bite's catchy, so don't worry about getting sick for me. But thank you. Yeah, when Moses wants to see God's face, what is it God says to him? You can't. No one can see God's face and live. If you have God in his total light being present there, all right, it's going to condemn the people. There's a shrouding, there's a condescension that he does to them by covering himself in the darkness. She's handing me that. I'll take thank you. Thank you. And where by shrouding himself in the darkness, he can do exactly what you're saying about be present there with them and lead them, and then yet direct themselves to him. But it's protecting them, right? You know how we talk. My favorite Christmas carol, right? "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," where it's veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. That the only way that we can see God like that is to be present. I love that analogy with, that Moses asked to see God face to face on the mountain, and God said no. But what did God do? At the Mount of Transfiguration, God puts Moses on the mountain in the Promised Land, and he's looking at God face to face in the person of Jesus Christ. And isn't that cool? That it was beautiful that God makes a way that even in our fallen state, that he can be present with us to the largest extent possible. Ooh, all right, pardon me. All right. Oh, I'll lie down and wait for it. I got a bed in my office. Perfect. Any of you know R.C. Sproul? He passed away a number of years ago. I went to his church, St. Andrew's Chapel, up there years ago, when he was still alive, and he preached 2 services, and he had been in between the services. He'd be horizontal. He would go right to his office, lie down, wake up right before the next service. He did that and preached as well as anybody ever had. All right. Okay, here. On 7, according to 8:15 and 8:20, why is Solomon blessing the Lord? Yes, and his promise was to whom? To David. And he's thank you. Sarah's giving me tips. All right. Just the joy that God is indeed faithful. It says, read through these verses and list every reference you can find to something God promised to do and then did. I got 3. Maybe you got more. What do you guys have? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yep. David's son was to build a house. I have also that he said he would choose a city, and he did. He chose Jerusalem. What else do you have? I guess I have one more. No. There's David's son sits on David's throne, and there's just one generation before, right, with Saul, Saul's son Jonathan, and Jonathan's up in my high list of people I'm looking forward to meeting in heaven. He just seems like just such a great guy all the way through, and yet he doesn't get the privilege of sitting on his father's throne. And he's gonna he dies in battle, and David mourns him. All right, and so Solomon gets that blessing. And of course, Solomon would have known the story. Yeah. All right, okay. Let's see here. How much? So here in 22 through 53. This is a lengthy prayer by Solomon, and it's really a good one, as you'd expect out of Scripture. Sarah writes these words. She says, "At the dedication of the temple, Solomon prays to the Lord. For the most part, his prayer is a series of requests for God to act when his people are in trouble. As you read through Solomon's prayer, complete the chart of what Solomon asked God to do when certain situations arrive." So let's just go through it piece by piece. So she's done the first one for us, and that's in verses 29 and 30. There we read, "May your eyes be open towards this temple night and day, this place of which you said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer your servant prays toward this place. Hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive." So she has it filled out for us here. When one of God's people prays towards the temple, God, please listen and forgive. All right, so in 31 and 32, let's read that, and then you can tell me the answer. When a man wrongs his neighbor and is required to take an oath, and he comes and swears the oath before your altar in this temple, then hear from heaven and act. Judge between your servants, condemning the guilty and bringing down on his own head what he has done. Declare the innocent not guilty, and so establish his innocence. So when what happens? What's the situation? So a man's going to sin against a neighbor, and what is he asking God to do? Yeah, so to actually judge the guilty and vindicate the righteous. So God may this temple be a place of honest judgment alls. All right, may this may your justice reign supreme here. All right, 33 to 34. What do we have there? When your people, Israel, have been defeated by an enemy because they have sinned against you, and when they turn back to you and confess your name, praying and making supplication to you in this temple, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people, Israel, and bring them back to the land you gave to their fathers. So what's happened? What's the situation here? Yeah. So when Israel's gotten beaten up by their enemies, and why are they getting beaten up? Because they sinned. All right? Because it's assumed they're not going to lose in battle if they're following God. But you've lost in battle. Why? Because of your sin, and therefore you're in a bad spot. So what is he asking God to do? Yes. And then let's do one more, and then let's talk about these for as far as we got. So in verse 35 and 36, when the heavens are shut up and there is no rain, because your people have sinned against you, and when they pray toward this place and confess your name and turn from their sin because you have afflicted them, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel. Teach them the right way to live, and send rain on the land you gave your people for an inheritance. So what's the situation? Drought. And why do we have the drought? And what does he ask God to do? Yeah. Forgive and then grant the rain. Okay, so again, when you think of the situation where the people are, they're in exile reading this. And what do they see over and over again? Okay, therefore, what for them is their take-home lesson? Well, stay on the right side. Yeah, from then on. But given that they're in the middle of the judgment right now, what is their immediate, what do they have to do first and foremost? Turn to him. And God, please, we don't deserve it. We get it. But as Solomon prayed, please hear our prayers and forgive. And of course he does, right? And that's, we have Ezra and Nehemiah where the temple's going to get rebuilt. It's only a remnant who come back, but they come back. And then of course, the sending of Jesus, the blessing above all blessings. There's remember hearing a story, you've probably heard it before, where it was back like the 1920s or maybe a little later. The skeptic had asked this preacher. He said, "How do you know the Bible's true?" And he said, "I can prove the Bible's true in one word." He said, "Israel." And just the odd way in which, since the time of Abraham, the Jews have been persecuted in the oddest ways possible, and have also been protected and blessed in the oddest ways possible. They just have been. I know Mark Twain, who was an atheist by all accounts, he commented, referred to the Jews as the world's intellectual aristocracy. They just got a bunch of smart people. Not that others don't, but on average, they're just really bright. You look at. I was talking with Ryan, medical guy. This is Ryan, so don't take it completely. But he was complaining about the fact that we spend so much for medicine here in the United States. We do. We spend a lot of money, by far more than anybody else does. And why is it? Because most, essentially all of the research into new medicines is done here. A lot is done by German companies, but they do it here because there's more. This is where you make the money by doing medical research, and then other countries just steal the stuff and use it. So, you either get upset about it or you say, well, praise the Lord, we get to bless the world that way. But the one other nation that makes significant medical advancements is Israel. And they're just a little itty-bitty country. And yet, they've just been used by God to be such a blessing. Or let's do just a couple more, and then we'll call it a day. I think we're on so 41 and this is a good one. This is like you and me. Let's go to 41. As for the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, for men will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm when he comes and prays toward this temple. Then hear from heaven your dwelling place, and do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. So you're a little different situation. We're not talking about sin. What's going on here? Yeah, some Joe Blow, some guy nobody knows, wanders in. But what does he do? Praise the temple. And what does he ask for God to do? Answer his prayer, so that he too may know that that the Lord, he is God, right? When 44 to 45, and we'll stop with this. When your people go to war against your enemies, wherever you send them, and when they pray to the Lord toward the city you have chosen, the temple I have built for your name, then hear from heaven their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause. So just a straightforward one there, which is what? Uphold their cause. So bless our armies. You know, every Sunday, most every Sunday, sometimes I forget, but yeah, one of the things I pray for is, you know, pray for our armed forces. You know, Father, you know, it's in heaven, we won't need armies, we won't need a police force, but we're in a fallen world, and now we do. Man, it's Lord, please protect us, you know, and yeah, good stuff. So, all right, I'm gonna go get horizontal for a few minutes. Thank you, everybody.